Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and today we're talking about backup. And for a lot of small businesses, it can be a scary proposition, but we have with us special guest Deni Connor today, who's founding analyst at Storage Strategies. Now I'm going to talk about the right strategy and putting the right balance of capabilities and complexity into your decision-making process around a backup solution. How are you doing this morning, Deni?
Hi there, I'm fine. How are you, Mario?
I am awesome. And joining with me is Erik Pounds, Director of Product Management here at Drobo, and together we'll have a conversation about backup. I'll first start as we go to the next slide by introducing Erik. You spent many years in data protection software, correct?
Correct, Mario. I spent my first 8 years of my career working on data protection solutions for the SMB space, and so I'm really excited to be with you here to talk about this interesting topic and help people really protect their vital business data.
On to the next slide in the abstract. The SMB market has largely been underserved by data protection offerings that were really built for enterprise companies. And as we've seen over the past decade or so, the needs of SMBs has really grown, and a lot of vendors have come up with some great solutions that can tailor to the needs of SMBs. And we want to use this broadcast to talk about some of the terminology and some of the choices behind the elements you're going to want to incorporate into a data protection strategy. We know that SMBs here at Drobo don't have the same IT resources that larger companies do. And it's either through the help of a value-added reseller or through putting together components that are known to work well together that help make a storage solution, or in this case, a specifically data protection solution, a little bit easier to put together. And I'm happy you could join us today, Deni, because your firm provides a selection of briefs and other analysis in the form of white papers and validation services for storage companies. Can you give us a little more background about what Storage Strategies Now does?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Storage Strategies Now, I founded about 3 years ago after I left Network World, where I had spent almost 10 years covering enterprise storage. You know, the kind of storage systems that big businesses use, not small businesses. During that time, I realized that acquiring, configuring, and managing storage is complex and really expensive. I thought back to a time when I managed a network by myself in an organization of about 40 employees. The network we had consisted of 2 servers, 30 to 40 Windows, and Macintosh desktops. And the data we kept at the time was almost 2 terabytes, and that was 20 years ago. You know, I'd hate to think about how much data it would be now and how much data we had to protect. But at the time, I spent time configuring applications, supporting users, installing hardware, backing up the network, all while doing what was my primary job responsibility, which was managing the production of 3 magazines. You know, that wasn't all. We didn't have a lot of money to buy new storage or servers, and the type of storage that vendors were offering was often really expensive. For the tasks that were too complex for me to handle, because I was editing magazines, I had to rely on a value-added reseller who installed them and supported them for me. So in 2007, I founded Storage Strategies Now to cover the types of storage technologies that small businesses, mid-sized businesses, and enterprise businesses use. I'd like to say that I'm happy to join Drobo in this webinar today to talk about a study that SSG Now published last year. And Erik, I think I'll turn things over to you now.
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks for the background, Deni. In terms of some analysis, as we go here to our next slide, we are doing some analysis on the SMB market. And this is something that's available in the paper that I gave a link for on the previous slide. We'll give another link for it at the end of this presentation for you to get more information on analysis done by Deni and her team over at Storage Strategies Now. But you're not the only one, Deni, who has a small firm. In fact, according to your analysis, there's more than 8 million firms with less than 1,000 employees. Even today, you're in a small business at SSG.
That's right. And the needs of small businesses, like the one I managed and the one that I have now, are much the same as big businesses. We're just smaller. We comprise about 95% of American businesses. In the study that we did, we found that the amount of data that small and mid-sized businesses manage is often disproportionate to their size. We talked to several 30-person organizations that have as much as 80 to 100 terabytes of data. We talked to organizations that had 3 terabytes of data and sometimes even less. But what they were trying to do was attempting to manage and protect that data and often do it without dedicated IT resources. In one organization we talked to, for example, which was a medical x-ray clinic, the practice administrator was responsible for managing the practice, human resources, finance, IT, and he would even vacuum the carpets if he was asked. And they had 30 employees and were backing up daily about 3 terabytes of data. We found that small business segments that have large amounts of data include energy exploration and extraction, engineering, healthcare practices, law firms, and motion picture video productions, to name a few. For example, in the making of the movie Avatar, the rendering of that data, which was over a petabyte of storage, was done by Weta Digital, a company that had 570 full-time and contract employees. So small and mid-sized businesses have the same needs for data protection and storage systems as big businesses, and they require the same enterprise features.
In your experience, Erik, when it comes to the priority of data protection, it's not really the most fun thing to do in IT, but as Deni mentioned, the folks that are doing it often have 4 or 5 different tasks that are priorities. It's becoming more of a high priority these days in terms of focus.
And Mario, absolutely. I mean, in the past, small businesses, especially if we look at smaller businesses, they often do not start protecting their data till they've encountered their first disaster, which is unfortunate. I mean, it's us as trusted advisors, as vendors, need to do our best to educate small and medium-sized businesses to protect their data up front before they experience a pain point initially. That's usually that first component. And then it's getting at SMBs also to not just protect their data with one redundant copy, but also make sure they're protected from a major disaster, fire, flood, theft, things like that, by getting their data off-site. And so there's different levels of data protection for small and medium business that us as vendors and advisors need to help them with.
In your study, Deni, did you find people still think of backup as insurance, or is it really becoming more of a mainstream part of the thinking, even in small businesses?
In the companies that we talked to, they did think of it as insurance, but they didn't start thinking of it as insurance until after something happened. We talked to one organization, for example, who had a fire in their production facility. They had data stored in tapes off-site, but it still took them about 3 to 5 days to recover that data, and they weren't in business during that time. So they did take out insurance on data. They started protecting their data with a cloud-based service, and as well as backing up their data to tape to ensure that if something happened again, a fire, a hurricane, whatever, that their business wouldn't be at risk and that they'd be able to recover.
All right, we're on the next slide talking about terms, and you talked about cloud-based storage there, Deni. Part of the complication for a lot of folks that are looking into this for the first time is that there's too many choices. There's no small, medium, and large to choose from, but rather a lot of different approaches. The classic approach is backup to tape, and for the folks who want to get a lot more background on these terms, you can find information on these in the Storage Strategies Now report that's on Drobo's website. But backup to tape is kind of the classic way of doing it. It's always been seen as the least expensive. What are you seeing about people using tape these days, Erik? Are small businesses 100 people or fewer, or even 100 to 1,000? Where does tape fit in these days?
Well, first off, the reason why tape became very popular for data protection is that it is portable and relatively high capacity and inexpensive. Portable being the number one requirement. Initially, this was very expensive, and it wasn't mobile at all. So protecting yourself from a major disaster was not possible. So it was common that you backed up directly to tape, so then you could take the tapes off-site, and if you had a major disaster, you could restore the data that was critical to you. Going to the next step, when you talk about backup to disk, this is where when you introduce disk into the backup system, or what they initially called stage backup, where you went from your primary disk, whether it's on your server or your laptop, to another disk drive for local protection for disaster recovery that's not a major disaster like fire or flood, and then off the tape for offsite protection. That was an optimal type solution for small to medium-sized business, or any size business that matters, because they could quickly restore their data as well as be protected offsite. That was the leveraging of both disk and tape in an environment like that.
Deni, where do you see virtual tape playing a role in small business? Because it's brought up in the conversation of disk-based backup. Are these mutually exclusive type of terms, disk to tape and virtual tape library? How would someone distinguish that if they're a small company?
I think that small companies would be best to look at disk to tape as opposed to some of the virtual tape technologies. But both of these are a staging mechanism for the transfer of data to tape. We talked to many organizations who, of course, said, I hate tape. I want to get rid of tape. They really didn't get rid of tape. They just substituted disk for it or VTL for it, even though they're still maintaining their tape off-site. They're also looking at the cloud as a supplement to storing data on-site, not for their primary data, but for their backup or their archive data.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, to Erik's point, the backup includes not just the first copy, which exists at your site, but also the copies that you want to get off-site to protect from a disaster. We'd also at Drobo recommend that the primary copy is also protected with RAID technology, or in the case of Drobo, beyond RAID technology, so that you have a data protection strategy that protects the first copy, the second copy, and the third copy. This is where it gets kind of complicated, Erik, because people are thinking, goodness, I'm a small business. I just want to make sure my data is protected. Why so many copies?
Well, Mario, if you just walk through what you need to protect against and how you would restore from any type of a disaster or a corruption, or if you get a virus or something, that's what leads you to having these multiple copies. So, for example, let's say you have a user that is working on a very critical file, and that file gets, they messed up that file for some reason, and they want to go back to a previous version. With a good backup strategy, you have previous versions on local disk inside your business, so you could quickly restore that file back to that user's machine, and then they can continue working in a productive way. Now, obviously, if they have a laptop that dies for whatever reason, a hard disk failure, they could replace that failed hard disk with a new one and do a full system restore and be back up and running. You can only do that if you have high-performance backups local in your environment. And today, the common way to do that is to have a disk array, and you back up to that disk array locally. Now, when it comes to offsite protection, which is protecting yourself from whether it's you need to recover a file that's months back, or you need to protect yourself from a major disaster, that's why you have your data also offsite. Now, when you mention cloud backup, when we talk about disk to tape, that tape is used for offsite protection. That could be swapped out with online backup or cloud backup. The only challenge there is having the available network bandwidth to get your critical data offsite. Now, there's methods with cloud backup companies where you could seed the offsite backup, where you essentially ship them all of your data, and then you're just doing incremental backups over time. The beauty of cloud backup is that it's simple, it's automated because it can use your internet connection. You're not hauling tapes or disks all over the place. But it may not meet some requirements just because of the bandwidth issues.
Mm-hmm. Deni, I want to ask you about backup methods, because as enterprises have seen, they've begun to do things like snapshots and use CDP, or continuous data protection, for application to have a faster time to recovery. And have better uptime. Is this something that the small businesses are using too, or is really the first step to make sure you have a good file-based backup?
Well, I think it's based on a continuum of how fast you need to be able to recover your data. For example, snapshots allow you, which you take every 15 minutes or every hour of the day, allow you to recover your data very quickly, while online backup may take a little bit longer. Let me give you a case in point. We had a failure on our network last week where one of our users lost the drive on their laptop. We were able to restore most of that data from a on-site NAS device, but the software we were using didn't support versioning. Mm-hmm. So even though we were able to recover data very quickly from the on-site NAS device, we had to recover a version of an Outlook PST file, which was older because the primary PST file had been corrupted on the NAS device, from the online backup service that provides versioning capability. So we were able to download a copy of the PST file and recover that user to where they were before. So small business needs to look at all different forms of backup and decide how fast they need to get it back, how fast they need to be able to get their applications back, which applications they need to get back first, whether it's their databases, their email, at what point they're going to get their front office applications back, and how they're going to do it and deploy a strategy that accommodates many different forms of backup.
I'll quickly cover encryption, compression, and deduplication. And it's very hot topic amongst larger enterprise customers, and small businesses also want to be able to take advantage of some of these solutions. And the good news is that in the case of deduplication or encryption, a lot of these are available as software options within the backup software. And that's probably the best place to think about putting it if you're a small business architecting your strategy. And in the case of a lot of these solutions, you can use them in conjunction with future purchases of dedicated appliances that can do that same function. I think that with anything, there's a trade-off of where you do the processing. In the case of backup, from folks who aren't yet doing it, it's important just to start with a file-based backup or incorporate some of the other backup technologies. And if you have requirements for encryption, you can add those in to your solution. What are some of the ways they can do that, Erik?
Well, Mario, I think, and you're right, I mean, when it comes to encryption, compression, and even deduplication, or you could think of it as what they call single instance storage, meaning you're only backing up the same file one time. If everyone in your network has the same file, there's no reason to store it 50 or 100 times. I think there's some key rules to thumb here. When it comes to compressing your data, yes, always do it if your backup window allows you to do that. Yes, it takes a little bit longer, but it saves you a lot of storage space. When it comes to encryption, if your data is going off-site, make sure it is encrypted. It's a very basic yes or no strategy. If it is leaving your building, encrypt it. Because in your backup strategy, it's very hard to classify, what is data that needs to be encrypted, what is data that doesn't have to be encrypted. It's very complex for a small business to do that. If it leaves the building, encrypt it. And most data protection products today support encryption, AES 128, AES 256 encryption.
In terms of looking at the requirements for SMB backup storage, we at Drobo feel there's really 5 top criteria by which folks are going to want to look at storage. One being cost effectiveness, because if you cannot afford to put together a robust solution, it's best to buy what you can afford that optimizes for that protection. And in the process, choose things that are going to make it easier, not just for you to get it set up, but also for ongoing operation. Backup, as we've talked about already, can be very complicated with the different tiers of backup, different technologies that you're mixing in. So the most important thing is to have something that's easy and repeatable, so you can have a reliable restore. Now, performance is almost always one of the things that people look at when it comes to selecting anything. When we look at cars, we look at its 0 to 60 time and its raw horsepower. But in many cases, for small businesses, they don't need the highest performing system in order to meet their needs. And in most cases, they should be optimizing for other criteria more. But that being said, you want to pick something that's going to give you good performance. We'll talk about a comparison as to where that becomes important from a service level perspective. And what we always like to tell folks is if you're going to choose a solution, you don't need to buy the same features in multiple places. If you buy a software application that can support certain things like snapshots or like deduplication, would you need to buy that same thing in the hardware? It doesn't make sense if you're a small business to pay for it twice. So you can look to buy cost-effective components throughout the architecture and save a little bit of money that way. We feel iSCSI is a good technology match for these criteria in terms of serving as the disk in the disk-to-disk to tape or disk-to-disk to offline cloud storage type of solution. Going on to this comparison, Deni, your paper talks a lot about the pros and cons of each approach, and we don't want to make it seem as like tape doesn't operate very well. And today, it still works very well, but as you mentioned in your paper, it's not necessarily dead. The mission has just changed a little bit here as we've gone into the 21st century.
That's right, it is. And, there's some things to look at that we've historically had, such as reliability, media failures, for example. And, mechanical components in tape libraries fail, and tape's sometimes not very reliable. But one of the things that we need to look at is the recovery and the restore performance of tape. And that's where you really see some differences between tape and disc. We did a study for a customer, and we found that about 1 in 10 recovery images on tape are unrecoverable. That in an instance where you're using LTO3 tape, which has a capacity of 400 gigabytes, it could take as much as 8 hours to restore. And that's just for a single tape. If you look at estimates, it costs an IT department around $2,000 to process and restore a single backup tape. And that expense adds up with each backup tape you need to process. It might not just be one, it may be multiple tapes. With disk, you have a recovery and restoration performance that's very good, and so you don't need to worry about that. With tape, you also have money that needs to be spent each year to support backup, and you have to keep in mind your ability to restore tape from drives that may be legacy or outgraded. So there are a number of differences between tape and disk-based backup. But as we say, tape is certainly not dead. The small businesses we talk to want to keep their tape, but only as a supplement to their disk.
Right, providing that offsite capability. And some of the things that we've seen recently in terms of developments are the price of disk coming down to make it more of a comparable factor, as well as power efficiency. Folks don't like the idea of something being powered on all the time, but a lot of modern storage systems will allow you to spin down the disks and go into a very power-saving mode during the time when it's not in operation, and then it springs into action when it's time to do the backups, typically in a scheduled time during off-peak hours. So for smaller companies, they can benefit from SAN storage, not just for their primary applications, but by going to a consolidated SAN solution, they can offer themselves the ability to use that SAN storage as a disk-based target for their disk-to-disk to offsite type of solution. So from a cost perspective, power perspective, a lot of things have improved. And as you mentioned, Deni, the reason to really look at disk is the better way it will do your restores in a random access fashion, as well as just sheer performance in that type of solution. In terms of leveraging backup technology here, our second to last slide, Erik, folks have concerns about cost and complexity, most certainly. You designing not just the software solutions, but also hardware solutions, there are ways to work around some of this stuff. What are some of the things that you tell customers?
Right. Well, cost and complexity is definitely a component of that. So also some of the biggest challenges they have is just figuring out how to best protect what they need to protect. So, for example, some businesses decide that, well, I'm only going to protect my critical business servers. And, for example, they don't protect their desktops and workstations. Mm-hmm. But what they need to look at is how much critical data they have sitting on those desktops and notebooks that may not be sitting on those servers. For example, here at Drobo, we have a lot of engineers that are writing code that live on their individual machines that they may not check in for a while. That's critical that we protect those machines to ensure that we don't lose a lot of critical innovation that goes into developing our products. The other is operating system support. You mentioned, for example, image-based backup as a way. There's some great image-based backup tools out there today that are built for Windows, but if you're leveraging, let's say, Linux or Mac OS X, you may not be able to use that same software because it's leveraging key components, key technologies, APIs from Microsoft. You also have to look into what applications you have to protect. Do I need to protect Exchange? Do I have a database application that requires some special attention? You protect those in a little bit of a different way. So you have to figure out, okay, what do I need to protect and then what application best fits my needs? Sometimes you may even have to look into using two different types of applications in your environment. So plan up front, make sure you protect all your data, and then implement a good solid backup strategy. I think, Mari, we already talked about offsite protection. The last thing I'll mention is test your data protection strategy. Yep. Test it. Test backing up. Test restoring. Deni was mentioning earlier about challenges restoring from tapes. A lot of that happens because either you're encrypting them and you forgot your password or your key, or it was written by an older version of software and then you can't figure out how to restore it. Definitely test your restores as well, because when you have a major disaster, you want to get back up and running as quickly as possible, to save your business as much money.
And folks, there's a lot more information in the Storage Strategies Now report, Data Protection Recovery in the Small and Medium-Sized Business. It's available on Drobo's website there at the URL provided. I'm going to do a real quick recap here of an example of a disk backup solution that also includes deduplication. Symantec's a well-known vendor in the data protection space. They're used here as an example, but you can get the idea that it could be with just about any other software application. And even in a small business environment, you can have a small number of servers. In this case, we show you 3 servers out there. One running a lot of virtual machines. One is the email server. Another one as the backup server. That could be a VM even inside the server if you really want it to be in terms of a small number. But you can leverage a combination of client-side and server-side software that can provide the data protection elements you need and even include things like deduplication without the need for specialty hardware. You'll need some pooled shared storage to provide the disk-based target for that environment. As we show you on the right-hand side, if you wanted to go for a solution that was really appliance-based as well as SAN-based that you could buy on the marketplace, it could run you over $20,000 US. And in the greater scheme of things as an insurance policy, this is actually a good investment to make for folks who want to make sure they can protect their business. But looking on the left-hand side, you can use a combination of software and hardware and achieve the same benefits at a smaller scale that work great for a small-sized business for about half the cost. And we'd urge anybody who's looking at a storage solution for data protection to make sure that they're investing what they can to protect everything. You mentioned, Eric, that some folks make trade-offs. They'll protect some stuff but not the other. It's probably better to have a strategy that you can afford that protects it all versus just optimizing on a small bit, because you never know when someone's going to ask you to get something back. And I know that a lot of folks want to make sure they protect everything. So as we go to our question and answers, Deni, I'll give the first one to you. Eric talked about encryption of backups being important as you go off-site. But what about on-site? Do you normally recommend folks add the complexity of encryption if the first copy is remaining on-site?
We do recommend that, just because there are so many right now laws and compliance issues involved with data being taken outside of an organization and with protecting one department's data from another, that we do feel encryption is important. I think one of the most important things to look at is that at one time encryption was considered to be an enterprise feature. And now it has been incorporated into much data protection software for small businesses and can become a checklist item.
All right. In terms of replication versus backup, Eric, a lot of folks see them as the same thing. As it's both. They're both data protection. How does one play versus the other? And do you really try to go for all replication, or really is it a combination of both?
Well, Mario, first off, when you talk about replication, you're really talking about a specific application or a server. It's not really about protecting all of your data, let's say, that lives on your desktops or notebooks. When you're talking about replicating a server, often you're doing it for high availability, and you're trying to be able to get that server back as quickly as possible. So, for example, there's synchronous replication where you're keeping 2 servers in sync all the time, and then there's asynchronous replication where you're replicating offsite. But even when you replicate offsite, there's solutions that allow you to fail over to that server in a different location. This becomes more of a solution if you have a remote office, or if you have your reseller or your service provider that can provide you space in an offsite data center.
Speaking about offsite, Deni, the last question I have is about cloud and whether it's practical for small business. Some people are looking at the possibility of maybe doing everything in their business in the cloud. And I know you talked about some of the companies that you surveyed. They're always going to have local data, whether they're creating media or they have local records there. But do you see that the 100% cloud solution is realistic, or is it always going to be a hybrid of local storage and cloud to maximize cloud for what it's best for, which is the offsite part?
I don't see cloud 100% as being practical for a small business, but rather that a hybrid approach of maintaining a on-site copy as well as an off-site copy in the cloud to replace a traditional disaster recovery approach where data is replicated to a off-site facility or where tapes are shuttled to an off-site facility. Cloud storage is very practical. It is inexpensive. And it's a very easy to implement approach for a small business, either through a traditional storage service provider or through an MSP, a managed service provider, who is now providing cloud storage services.
And we at Drobo have several partners of ours that use Drobos actually as the back-end storage for the remote copy in a lot of cases, as well as leverage Drobo's Drobo Sync capability with our Model B800 FS product that allows you to do offsite backup integrated into one solution. So with that, the key takeaways for today: small and medium businesses have the same needs to protect business data that larger ones do. They just don't always have the same resources. And with that, we know that you can't always have a full dedicated IT resource. So there are value-added resellers that can provide a lot of that capability. And there are technology solutions that have come to market the past 10 years, which aren't 100% dedicated to tape or large-scale storage systems that can be put together on the scale of a small business to provide that protection. And we always say that it's best to make sure that you're protecting everything, and it's more than just insurance. It's a part of operating your business and should be seen as one of those costs that you have to invest in order to have the right solution. Disk-based backup provides an efficient strategy that gives you the benefits of tape while giving you better restore times, and you can continue to use things like tape or offsite backup with cloud to provide the resiliency from a site-wide disaster or the need to access the data from a remote location. So quick and easy to use disk storage solutions are available and should be considered in the strategy for a small and medium business. With that, I want to thank everybody for their participation. We'll be putting information up on our website at drobo.tv. If you have any other questions, you can get us at tv@drobo.com or get us on Twitter at Drobo. And I want to thank you, Deni, for joining us today, and urge everybody out there to go check out the paper that Storage Strategies now put together that's hosted on the Drobo site to give you even more in-depth information about the topics that we covered in today's webcast. Thanks again, Deni.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Until next time, happy sharing.